You want to hear it all? Fine. You want to dive into this mess, my mess, and taste the bitterness that's been lodged in my throat for weeks. All right then. I'll give it to you, every last word. I'm in my living room. The light's too bright, or maybe my eyes hurt. My head is pounding. I haven't really slept since. God, I can't even remember the last time I closed my eyes and stayed in the dark without seeing those images. They flash and burn across my mind like a broken reel of film, each frame a little more twisted, a little more damning. Half of me wants to stop talking right now, but I started this, so I'm going to finish it. That's all that's left for me, right? Follow through. Maybe that's the only promise I can still keep. I remember the screaming. It was me. Me at the hospital, feeling utterly helpless as Catherine tried to smile through her exhaustion. The baby was coming. Our daughter. My miracle, I thought. The most important moment in my entire life. I was shaking so much that the nurse had to tell me to calm down, or they'd make me wait outside. Catherine's eyes were hazy, half-lidded with pain, but she still managed this small, weirdly radiant smile. My heart soared. I believed that smile was for me, her husband, the father of her child. I believed so completely that we had it all. They whisked me out at one point, hospital policy, or maybe they saw how rattled I was. I don't know. I can't even process it properly. But I do remember the unstoppable sense of anticipation, the insane joy in my chest, the adrenaline blasting through my veins. My daughter was about to enter the world. I was going to be a father, the man who'd read bedtime stories, fix bicycles, teach her how to be strong, how to be kind. It was going to be perfect, or so I told myself. I still try to cling to that memory. The first time I held her in my arms, the entire universe shrank to that tiny, squirming bundle. She was so warm, her little fists curling and uncurling. She made a small cry, so fragile, so full of life. Everything else in my mind just fell away, disappeared. I looked at Catherine. She was beyond exhausted, but she watched me with tears in her eyes. I thought I knew what she was feeling. I thought I could read her soul. Maybe I saw what I wanted to see. Contentment, gratitude, relief, love. But there's a difference between illusions and truth. And the truth. The truth was that something was already rotting between us, a secret that refused to stay buried. But I was too infatuated, too lost in fatherly bliss, to sense that odor of betrayal. Too stupid, too trusting, too loyal. She had to stay in the hospital a while, the doctors wanting to keep an eye on her and the baby. I was home, anxiously preparing for their return, painting the nursery walls a soft peach color, assembling the crib, triple-checking the baby monitor, all the typical new dad rituals. Nights turned to days, days to nights, all merging in a blur of coffee cups and frantic phone calls to see if Catherine was comfortable. She always said she was fine, said the baby was fine. I believed her. Why wouldn't I? She was my wife. But there was a nagging sense that something else was happening. I tried to brush it off as worry or the normal anxiety any father feels. But the tension in her voice when we talked, there was an odd quiet after I'd say I loved her. She used to respond right away, used to laugh, used to make jokes. Now she'd pause, as if I'd forced her into a corner with those 3 words. And I ignored that too. Told myself postpartum stress can do strange things, that she just needed space, that she'd come home soon, and we'd sort it out. She came home eventually, cradling our daughter, tears shining in her eyes, as if she was overwhelmed with gratitude to be back. She pressed the baby to her chest and looked at me with a faint, flickering light in her gaze. It resembled love. It had to be love. I tried to open my arms for a hug, but she stepped around me and took the baby to the nursery. She said she was tired, just needed a moment. That was the first time I felt the bottom drop out from under me. The first crack in my illusions that, ironically, I'd built for both of us. I had no idea how quickly the crack would spread. In just a few days, that fragile piece disintegrated into suspicion, confusion, and the kind of fear that wraps around your lungs and squeezes until you gasp for air. Let me say this. I'm not the paranoid type, but when your wife leaves late at night for fresh air, or because she forgot a prescription at the hospital, or just needs to pick up something at the 24-hour pharmacy, you start to notice. Then you hear the engine of a taxi or rideshare out front at 1 in the morning, and you realize something is off. And when it happens again the next night, you can't sit still. You open the damned phone, you check the taxi app, you see the addresses, the same destination, night after night. Like a homing pigeon returning to roost. Where is that place? Why does she go there? I still see that address burned into my memory. I won't say the exact street, but the neighborhood was across town, nowhere near the hospital. An area known for nightlife, for restaurants that stay open till dawn, for private clubs tucked between old warehouses. I tried to keep my sanity. Maybe she was meeting a friend, confiding postpartum frustrations. Maybe it was a support group. My mind threw up 1,000 rationalizations, each more desperate than the last. I tried telling myself I should just trust her, that I'd talk to her in the morning and we'd clear it up. But deep inside, a voice spat at me. She's lying. You fool. She's lying. That voice grew loud enough that I couldn't sleep. I paced the bedroom until dawn, imagining every twisted scenario. And each one ended with the same question. Why is she doing this now, right after giving birth to our child? Was it me? Did I fail her somehow? Or was there something else at play, a puzzle piece I'd never known existed? I had to find out. I told myself the truth would set me free. People who say that are idiots. The truth just changes you to your misery in a more honest way, that's all. But I had no choice. It was the 3rd or 4th time she left in the middle of the night. I felt my stomach twist as I watched the taxi icon creep across the phone screen. That same address. She didn't come home until nearly 4 in the morning. I was sick with worry and rage. The next night, I made a plan. I scheduled a car to pick me up and take me exactly where she'd gone. I'm standing outside this unremarkable brick building. There's a flickering streetlight, a couple of cars, a row of darkened storefronts. Above me, a narrow window glows faintly, like a watchful eye. I walked in circles for nearly half an hour, waiting, cursing my own cowardice for not barging in. Then, as if conjured by the devil himself, I see Catherine step out of that building with him. Marcus. I didn't know his name then, but I saw him clearly. Tall, well-dressed, confident posture. He had a hand on her lower back. She was leaning against him, exhausted, or maybe intoxicated by something far more dangerous than alcohol. She lifted her face, and the streetlight illuminated her features, features I thought belonged to me, that I'd worshipped in our private world. She was smiling. I recognized that smile, the one I'd fantasized she used only with me. They got into a black sedan parked around the corner, not a taxi but a private car. I hid in the shadows, fists clenched so tightly I thought my bones would snap. In that moment I wanted to die, but not before taking in with me, or her, or both, because that's what heartbreak does. It makes you insane. But I never confronted them that night. I stood there, heart pounding, tears burning at the corners of my eyes, watching as the car drove off. The cold wind slapped me in the face, but it couldn't numb the pain. I could have gone home, confronted her when she returned, demanded the truth, but something told me there was more to it. I had to understand the shape of the monster I was fighting. So I returned a few nights later. And again, each time, I'd witnessed the same twisted pageant. She'd arrive in a taxi. He'd wait for her at the entrance like a devoted paramour. They'd vanish inside for an hour or two. Then they'd leave together. Sometimes she looked distraught. Sometimes she looked giddy. But she never looked forced. It was as though she wanted to be there. That's what wrecked me the most. She wanted him. She wanted his touch, his comfort, or his filthy illusions. Whatever it was, it sure as hell wasn't me. I started hearing rumors, picking up bits and pieces from acquaintances. This Marcus guy was some kind of investor, a financial consultant with a streak of arrogance. I learned he'd known Catherine from her marketing work. Possibly it started as a business arrangement, but it escalated. Debts. She apparently owed him money, or he was covering for her with some big loan. The details weren't clear, but the fact that she'd hidden it from me was crystal. She had been drowning in secrets, and this man was the lifeline she chose. I was left on the shore, clueless, building a nursery and dreaming about fatherhood. That night, the one that truly snapped the last thread of my sanity, I decided to follow them inside. I told myself I was done lurking like a spy in the night. I had no illusions about what I'd find, but I needed to see it, needed the final bullet in my chest, so I could stop the sickening swirl of guesses. The hallway smelled of stale perfume and cigarettes. The carpet was worn, the walls yellowish under cheap lighting. I heard a laugh from behind a half-open door, a woman's laugh that ended with a hushed moan. My stomach lurched, but I stepped closer. Then I heard footsteps, voices. I slipped back behind a corner, chest hammering like a drum. They passed me, heading down the corridor hand in hand. Marcus was whispering something into her ear. She threw her head back, parted her lips in a smile that exposed her teeth, her eyes half closed in pleasure. I recognized the expression. It was the face I'd once seen when she was in my arms. Now it belonged to him. I followed them at a distance, feeling like an intruder in my own life. They entered a room at the far end of the hall. I stood outside, trembling. Through the thin walls, I could hear muffled voices, then a small laugh, then silence. My mind filled in the blanks. I swallowed hard and pressed an ear to the door. For a moment, there was just the faint rustle of movement. Then I heard a hushed groan. Her voice. Catherine's voice, laced with longing, with need, a sound I'd dreamed of so many times in our happiest nights. It was like hearing my own name hammered into the ground. I choked on my breath. Inside, there was another muffled exchange, more movement, and then the unmistakable sound of lips against skin, bodies pressing. I wanted to storm in, tear them apart. Instead, I sank to the floor, listening, tears in my eyes, because even though I already knew it was true, hearing it, that raw, intimate proof, just shattered me beyond anything I'd ever thought possible. For a long moment, I sat there in silent agony, my nails biting into my palms so hard that I drew blood. I don't know how long I stayed. The noises ebbed and flowed, intensifying at times, then dimming into murmurs. Each moan was a knife, each rustle of clothing a fresh cut. My brain was on fire. I begged for it to stop, but I couldn't tear myself away. I had to know how far she'd go, if she'd murmur my name by mistake, or if she'd call him by some pet name. But no, she was fully there, with him. Eventually, I forced myself to leave before they emerged. I stumbled out to the street, inhaling the sharp night air, feeling both dead and so horribly alive. I wanted to scream. I wanted to break something. But I just stood there, a hollowed-out shell of a man who'd lost the one thing he cared about. I asked myself, why? Why her? Why now? Why me? The sky didn't answer. I took a taxi home. I didn't sleep. That was the real start. You see, betrayal can kill you, or it can transform you. For a while, I hovered in that no-man's land, drifting between heartbreak and fury. I'd look at my daughter's picture on the phone and whisper apologies to her for being such a pathetic father. I'd stare at the empty side of the bed, the rumpled sheets that still held a ghost of Catherine's warmth. I'd brush my hand over them, half expecting her to appear. But she never did, not until morning, and even then, she arrived in that same hush of guilt, creeping inside like a thief. The next day, she pretended everything was normal. She hummed a lullaby while holding our baby. I stood in the doorway, arms crossed, feeling something inside me freeze solid. I was done. Or maybe I was only just beginning. Because right then, a plan started to form. Ugly, vengeful, but also satisfying in its promise of justice. If she needed control, if she wanted security from Marcus or from some shady arrangement, I'd take that from her. I'd make her debts mine. I'd become her new puppet master, the one pulling the strings. I had resources. My job in logistics wasn't glamorous, but I'd made connections. I called in favors, made discreet inquiries. And soon enough, I learned she was tied to Marcus financially. He'd backed some personal loan or covered certain high-interest debts. It got complicated, but the bottom line was, I could buy out that debt. If I did, I'd essentially become her sole creditor. It was an odd system, a tangled web of contract transfers and private agreements, but once I set it in motion, I felt an almost serene calm flooding me, because I was taking back control, because I was rewriting the script. Some might call it cruel. I call it self-preservation. I call it not letting her and that slick investor toy with my life any longer. If she wanted to slip into another man's bed, she could do so, but the consequences would be mine to administer. And so I moved quickly, quietly. Within days, everything was in place. I owned her debt. All the papers were signed, sealed, delivered into my trembling hands. I remember standing in my kitchen afterward, staring at the documents, my heart thudding with grim satisfaction. She suspected nothing. She still walked around with that faint guilt smile, probably thinking I had no clue, that I was just a tired new father oblivious to her midnight escapades. Then came the day I confronted her. She approached me, eyes puffy from lack of sleep, though whether it was the baby or her secret life draining her energy, I can't say. She mumbled something about needing more time, that she wanted to talk about the future. I told her to sit. She did, crossing her arms protectively. I slid the papers across the table. She frowned, flipping through them with increasing panic. When she finally grasped the reality that I had effectively stepped into Marcus's shoes, that all her debts and obligations were now owed to me, she froze. Her eyes darted from the page to my face. She tried to speak, but words caught in her throat. A part of me was giddy with the thrill of seeing her stunned, of forcing her to realize I wasn't the fool she took me for. I told her, quietly, that she had a new creditor now, that she could no longer run to Marcus for financial relief. I told her I wanted full control over every aspect of her life, her finances, her comings and goings, her freedom, essentially. She gasped, shock turning to horror, then rage. She tried to tear up the documents, but I already had copies, digital backups, everything locked in place. She lurched toward me with fists raised, screaming that I'd gone mad, that I'd ruined her. I just stood there, waiting for her tantrum to subside. She switched tactics, pleading, crying, insisting that she'd made a mistake, that she loved me, that she was confused. She tried to grab my hand, to force me to look her in the eye. She said the baby needed us. She said it was postpartum hormones, that she'd gone crazy for a while, but now she wanted to fix it. I stared at her, barely listening. My heart was cold. I'd wanted to die so many nights from the pain she inflicted, and now she thought a tearful apology would mend it. No, she'd made her bed in that dingy building, in that hush of moans and stolen nights. She could lie in it, as long as I saw fit. I told her that I needed time to decide how we'd proceed, time to figure out how she was going to repay everything she owed. She tried to argue that she wasn't a commodity, that she wasn't an object to be possessed. I reminded her she'd chosen money over loyalty, slipping into a twisted arrangement with that investor. She'd sold pieces of her life, and now those pieces belonged to me. It was cruel. I felt the cruelty like a blade in my chest. But I didn't stop. I was beyond stopping. The hatred in her gaze was tangible, but behind it lay something else. Fear, and maybe shame. She demanded to know what I'd do next. I told her the house was now mine, that I'd restructured the mortgage in my sole name. She was speechless. I let that sink in. Then I said if she wanted to keep living here, if she wanted even the hope of a normal life, she'd do as I said. She started to cry, loud, ragged sobs that shook her shoulders. A flicker of pity tugged at me. But pity had no place in this hell we created. I turned away, marched upstairs, leaving her with the reality of what she'd done. As I reached the bedroom, I heard our daughter's soft coo from the nursery. I stepped inside, stared at her in the crib. The baby was so innocent, so tiny, with absolutely no comprehension of the chaos swirling around her. My heart twisted in my chest. She deserved better than this. Better than a father consumed by vengeance, and a mother who'd sought solace in another man's bed. But it was too late. The damage was done, and the wheels of retribution were turning. The next few days were a surreal dance of forced politeness. Catherine still tried to maintain an appearance of normalcy, especially around the baby. We spoke only about feeding times, checkups, little mundane matters. At night, I could sense the tension in the walls. She was terrified of me. I was resentful of her. We coexisted like strangers locked in a war zone. Marcus tried to interfere. He called my phone one afternoon. I recognized his voice, low, smooth, with that faintly arrogant lilt I'd overheard in that hallway. He demanded to know what I'd done to Catherine, said that she'd told him everything was changing. He threatened to ruin me financially, to drag me into legal battles. I laughed in his ear, told him he no longer had a claim on Catherine. She was out of his ledger, out of his control. He spat curses at me, but we both knew I'd outmaneuvered him. He had no card left to play, no legal route that wouldn't expose his shady deals. I could practically taste his fury over the phone. It felt good, which maybe makes me as twisted as him. I waited for the next blow, but it didn't come. Days passed. Marcus went silent. Catherine sulked around, barely speaking, occasionally shooting me glances that mixed anger with desperation. At night, I'd lie awake, feeling empty. I used to imagine revenge bringing me satisfaction, but as the dust settled, I felt hollow. Like I'd lost a piece of my soul in this carefully orchestrated cruelty. My chest ached in a way that had nothing to do with heartbreak. It was the realization that I'd become a man I never wanted to be. Cold, vengeful, drunk on power over someone I once cherished. But I couldn't stop, couldn't let her see me waver, because the memory of her with him still stabbed me in the gut whenever I let my guard down. I'd hear that moan echo in my head, see that smile, and I'd want to break everything in sight. I'd remind myself that I had to stay on the path I'd chosen. That controlling her was the only way to survive the humiliation. Then came the day she finally tried to come clean. She approached me as I sat in the living room, staring at the TV that was turned on but muted. I was so lost in my thoughts I didn't notice her at first. She cleared her throat. I glanced over. She stood there, eyes rimmed with redness, hands trembling. She said, "I need you to listen to me. Really listen. Please." I said nothing, but I muted the TV entirely, giving her my undivided stare. She stepped closer, tears forming at the corners of her eyes. "I messed up," she whispered. "I got in over my head. Marcus offered money when I thought we were drowning, and I didn't see a way out. But it wasn't just the money. I was confused. You were so distant sometimes. We barely talked, and I felt alone." Her voice cracked. She went on, talking about her loneliness, about how postpartum depression had crept in, how she found an unexpected listener in Marcus, how they'd crossed a line she never intended to. She said she hated herself for it, that she was desperate to fix things. She cried, trembling, repeating how she was willing to do anything to save our family. My rage flared. "Anything?" I hissed. She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Then give me back what I lost," I said. She stared at me, confused, helpless, as if I'd asked her to turn back time and undo the nights she spent in his arms. "I can't," she said, voice barely audible. I laughed, a hollow, bitter sound that startled even me. I told her that's why I was done. She could pay off what she owed me, follow my rules, but we'd never be what we were. She broke down then, collapsed to her knees, hugging herself. Part of me wanted to kneel down, to hold her, to remember the woman who gave me my daughter. But the memory of that hallway, of her breathy moans through the door, chained me to my hatred. I got up and left the room, leaving her weeping on the floor. Days blurred into weeks. I found no peace, only a cold determination. I rarely spoke to her. She tiptoed through the house, tending to the baby, avoiding me. It was a quiet war, no direct battles, just an icy stalemate. One morning, I woke and realized the emptiness in my chest had spread through my entire being. I couldn't keep living like a ghost haunting my own home. So I acted again. I forced her to move out. Legally, I could. The house was under my name now. The mortgage restructured. I told her to pack her things, that I'd keep the baby until we could work out custody. She stared at me in shock, mouth falling open. Then she begged and pleaded, said she'd do anything I asked, that she was sorry, that she'd be a better wife, a better mother. Her voice was raw with desperation. But I stood firm. It's done, I said. You might come back eventually, but not now. And not without my conditions. She fought me, threatened to call the police, her parents, the media, whatever. But we both knew there was enough legal fine print to back me up. A chilling realization dawned on her that I'd planned for this from the start. She asked, "Why are you doing this to me?" Her voice cracked with an anger I used to think she only reserved for truly hateful things. My answer was simple. Because I can. And because she'd done something irreversible. Because every time I see her, my mind replays that filthy corridor. Because I loved her so damn much and she spat on that love. There was a perverse satisfaction in watching her realize she was powerless. Maybe that makes me a monster. But I was a monster she created. That's how I justified it. She left with a few suitcases, tears in her eyes, and not a single promise of a better tomorrow. The baby stayed with me. A nanny friend of ours helped out during the day, while I drowned myself in work, trying to keep my life afloat. Occasionally, Catherine would call or text, begging to see our daughter. I never refused, but each visit was supervised, short, tense. She'd hold our child, cooing, tears dripping onto the baby's tiny pink onesie. Then she'd give me this lost, pleading look, and I'd just stare at her until she left. I told myself that was enough, that I'd done what I had to. But every night, I'd lie awake, picturing her alone in some shabby apartment, maybe with no heat, terrified of the next day's bills, just like I'd once been terrified. Maybe she was calling Marcus, maybe not. I didn't know. The thought ate at me, fueling my nightmares. Then I'd check on the baby, watch her sleep so peacefully, and I'd wish for oblivion. Because the rage wasn't enough to fill the gaping hole in my soul. I was drifting, numb, half alive, wanting to die but refusing to let go because I had to care for my daughter. One day, something changed. Catherine showed up unannounced at the house. She looked exhausted, eyes ringed with purple, cheeks hollow. She wore the same clothes I'd seen her in days ago, as if she hadn't changed or showered. She pleaded, quietly, "Let me in." I was about to refuse, but she said she had the money. She'd found a way. She could pay me back, clear the debt. My chest tightened. How? I demanded. She just shook her head, wouldn't say. Maybe she'd sold everything she owned. Maybe borrowed from family. Maybe it was Marcus again. I felt a fresh burst of anger, but I stepped aside, letting her in because I wanted to see what desperation looked like on her face. She stood in the hallway, eyes flicking to the nursery door. The baby was napping. Then she turned to me, voice trembling. "Is this what you wanted?" she asked. My utter destruction. She tried to pass me a check, her hand shaking so badly it almost fluttered to the floor. I took it, scanned the numbers. It was enough. Enough to settle the financial side, at least on paper. She said, "Now, can I please come home?" Her lips quivered on the last word. Home. I felt a lump lodge in my throat. My initial impulse was to laugh in her face. Then I realized I couldn't breathe. I set the check down, swallowed past the dryness in my mouth. "What do you think is left here?" I asked, voice harsh. "You think you can just pay your way back into my heart?" She didn't answer. Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. I saw a flicker of her old spirit, the woman I'd once loved so fiercely. Something twisted inside me, a combination of pity, anger, and longing. But I'd come too far. I'd done too much. My entire identity now was built around not letting her break me again. So I shook my head and said words that felt like nails. "This house is taken. It's not yours anymore. It never will be." She stared at me, stunned, and in that moment, I saw the realization dawn that she had nowhere else to go, that I'd played my final card, and it was an ace of spades, black as night, lethal in its finality. She started to speak, but I turned away. "Go," I said quietly. I heard her breath catch, then a muffled sob. I stood there, rigid, eyes on the floor until she stepped out onto the porch. The door closed. And with it, the last shred of my illusions about family, about love, about second chances. In the days that followed, I was consumed by this unearthly calm. I'd feed my daughter, rock her to sleep. I'd keep the house in pristine order. Everything was under my control. No more shadows creeping in at night. No more clandestine rides to the other side of the city. I was the undisputed ruler of my domain. Yet the emptiness gnawed at me, day and night. Sometimes I'd walk through the house and see faint ghosts of her. Catherine laughing in the kitchen, reading on the sofa, falling asleep against my shoulder. I'd smell her perfume in the closet, the faint trace on her abandoned clothes. I'd stare at that memory and feel tears prick my eyes, but I'd blink them away, telling myself the price of betrayal was permanent banishment. Then I'd check on the baby, my precious girl, the only beautiful thing left in the wreckage. I'd kiss her forehead and whisper that I'd never let her feel that kind of pain, that I'd protect her from the cruelty of the world. But inside, a voice snarled that I'd already failed, that I'd built a new cruelty, one that would shape her life without even understanding it. Because how does a little girl grow in a house of icy silence? Time drifted. Maybe a month, maybe more. Catherine tried to call a few times. I ignored her. She sent letters begging to see the baby. Sometimes I'd let her come by, under my watchful gaze, but each time I'd stand in the corner, arms folded, a silent judge, waiting for her to break. She never did, though tears always glimmered on her cheeks. She'd whisper to our daughter, "Mommy loves you. Mommy loves you," as if those words could fix anything. And then one day, she didn't come. She didn't call. She vanished from my radar. For a while, it gave me a twisted satisfaction. Maybe she'd finally accepted the punishment I dealt. But as days turned to weeks, an odd worry sprouted in me. Where was she? Was she with Marcus again? Had she found a new solution, a new man, a new city? Sometimes I'd pace the hall at night, haunted by the possibility that I'd pushed her too far, that maybe she was lying dead in a gutter somewhere, one final debt unpayable. The thought unsettled me in ways I wasn't ready to admit. Eventually, I found out she'd gone back to California, to stay with her mother. Good for her, I told myself. Let her pick up the pieces somewhere else. Let her mother fix what she broke. And yet, I'd catch myself gripping the baby a little tighter, glancing at the door as if half expecting Catherine to walk in at any moment, tearful and penitent. But that moment never came. Some nights, I'd dream about the old life, Catherine leaning against me, pregnant and glowing, talking about how we'd name our daughter. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, hating how my subconscious tortured me with these phantoms of happiness. My days were methodical. Work, baby, feed, sleep, repeat. My heart felt like a dead muscle going through mechanical motions. I lived only because I had a child who needed me. Marcus, meanwhile, was out of the picture. I heard from a mutual acquaintance he'd moved on to bigger deals, that he'd left the city for a while. I felt no triumph at that. The drama I'd unleashed had consumed me so fully that the notion of victory tasted like ash. But that's how betrayal works. There's no real winner. And now, you ask if I'm happy about it. If I'm satisfied with my revenge. That's why I said at the start, you want to hear it all. Because there's nothing left. This is it. A house that feels too quiet. A bed that's always cold. A child that I hold close like a fragile shield against my darkest thoughts. I pace the rooms at night, cursing the ghosts, cursing my own name, cursing the day I ever believed in perfect love. Sometimes I think about taking a drive to the old building, the one with the flickering sign, just to stand there and remind myself how easily everything can be lost. But I don't. That place doesn't deserve my presence. And I'm not the same man who crouched outside the door listening to his wife betray him with another man. Now I just exist. I have enough money, enough control, enough power to bend my life into a shape that doesn't break me. But is that living? I'm not sure. Catherine was my dream. She was the future I wrapped myself in when the nights got cold. And she shattered it. Maybe I'd have forgiven her. Maybe we could have rebuilt something. But once the illusions are gone, you can't glue them back together. At least I couldn't. So that's the story. Every excruciating detail. You want to know how it ends. I don't have a satisfying final chapter. I only know I forced her out, made her debts my property, watched her crumble. I only know I'm alone in this house, with my precious baby girl, and a pit in my soul that echoes with the emptiness. You call it revenge. I call it survival. Either way, it leaves a rotten taste in your mouth. People say time heals all wounds. I say time just teaches you how to live with the scars. My daughter stirs from the nursery. I hear her little cry and realize it's almost feeding time. I guess that's my clue to end this confession. I'm the father now, the provider, the warden of a broken home that feels more like a fortress of regrets. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if death would be a mercy. But then I think of my daughter's tiny hands, her bright eyes looking up at me with trust. She deserves a father, at least a living, breathing presence in her life. So I stay. I endure. I numb my heart, freeze my emotions, lock them up so they don't twist me into something worse. Is that enough for you? Because that's all there is. You wanted the truth. You got it. Don't tell me it's tragic. I already know. Don't tell me it's painful. I feel it every second. But it's real. Cold as an Arctic wind, but real. And cold. Cold is still an emotion after all. So, yeah, that's everything. The story of how she broke me and how I broke her right back. The story of how I dreamed of a miracle and ended up with a nightmare. The story of betrayal, rage, and a revenge that tastes like dust in my mouth. If you were expecting a neat resolution, a moral about forgiveness or second chances, look elsewhere. This is my reality, and it's still unfolding, day by day, in tearful visits and lonely nights. Are we done here? Good, because I can't talk about it anymore without feeling like my chest's about to cave in. Now go on, get out. Live your life. Watch out for illusions. And if you ever see betrayal lurking in the corner, do yourself a favor. Never give it the chance to sink its teeth into your soul. If it does, you'll find yourself here, with me, in this house of silent echoes and locked doors. That's not a place you want to be. Trust me.